The blazing sun scorched the training range as laughter erupted across the dusty field. A petite recruit stepped forward, gripping a rifle that seemed too large for her small frame. The mocking voices grew louder. "What's she doing here? SEALs don't need dead weight like her." A harsh male voice cut through the crowd, dripping with contempt. She didn't respond, just tightened her grip around the trigger, took a deep breath, and her eyes turned to steel. When the gunpowder smoke cleared, the distant target exploded with 15 perfect bullseyes. No one was laughing anymore. Watch until the end of this video and you'll understand why a SEAL commander had to salute her like a hero. Meet Elena Cruz, 25 years old, standing barely 5'4", with deep brown eyes that held secrets the desert had taught her. She was the daughter of a border hunter from New Mexico, raised among the endless sands and the language of firearms. Elena had submitted her application for SEAL training with the same determination that had carried her through everything else in her life. The rejection came swift and brutal, not because she lacked skill, not because she lacked heart, but simply because she was a woman and didn't meet the physical standards. The humiliation started immediately. Fellow soldiers treated her like entertainment, calling her dead weight and liability behind her back, sometimes to her face. Her superiors were ice cold. "SEALs don't take charity cases," they'd say, as if her presence alone was an insult to their brotherhood. But there were details about Elena that didn't add up. Her hands were covered in calluses from years of shooting practice since childhood. On her uniform, she wore a faded silver patch that had belonged to her father, a former Special Forces operator from Desert Storm. And when she looked down the barrel of a rifle, something changed. The chaos around her would vanish. Her breathing would slow. There was a stillness in her gaze that separated her from every other rookie on that base. Most recruits carried nervous energy, constantly proving themselves, constantly talking. Elena carried silence like a weapon. The other soldiers couldn't figure her out. She never responded to their taunts, never tried to prove herself in the mess hall arguments, never joined the late-night competitions that built camaraderie among the troops. She simply existed in her own space, cleaning her weapon with methodical precision, studying maps when others watched movies, running alone while others slept. Her bunk was sparse. No family photos, no letters from home, just a worn book on advanced marksmanship and that silver patch carefully placed on her nightstand each evening. The patch bore the insignia of a unit that most of the younger soldiers had never heard of, but the older sergeants would sometimes glance at it with something that looked almost like recognition. The training base was buzzing with rumors. Some said she had connections, that someone higher up was forcing them to let her stay. Others whispered she was part of some diversity experiment that would fail spectacularly. But Elena never addressed the speculation. She moved through each day like she was preparing for something the others couldn't see. Then came the shooting trial. It wasn't official training, just an informal challenge that had grown out of boredom and testosterone. The targets were set at a distance that made even experienced SEALs hesitate. Many of the men who had been vocal about their superiority suddenly found reasons to hang back, to watch instead of participate. The wind was picking up, creating conditions that would challenge even the steadiest hands. Dust swirled across the range, and the heat created shimmer effects that could throw off the most careful calculations. It was the kind of day when smart shooters waited for better conditions. But Elena stepped forward. The laughter started again. Not the cruel mockery of before, but something worse. The kind of laughter that comes when people think they're about to witness an embarrassing failure. Someone in the crowd called out, "This should be good." Another voice added, "At least the entertainment's free." She didn't acknowledge them, just walked to the firing line, knelt down, and began setting up her position with the same methodical calm she brought to everything else. Where are you watching from? If you found yourself in this situation, what would your first emotion be? The atmosphere on the range shifted as Elena settled into her firing position. The SEAL trainees who had been bragging about their marksmanship skills all morning suddenly found themselves making excuses. The targets were nearly 1,000 yards away. The crosswind was brutal. Even the range instructor was shaking his head, muttering something about impossible conditions. But Elena had grown up in conditions like this. The New Mexico desert didn't offer perfect shooting weather. Her father had taught her that the best marksmen weren't the ones who waited for ideal conditions. They were the ones who could adapt to any challenge nature threw at them. She loaded her rifle with the same deliberate precision she brought to everything else. Each movement was economical, practiced. Her breathing began to slow, falling into the rhythm she'd learned as a child. The chaos of voices around her faded until there was nothing but the weight of the weapon, the feel of the trigger, and the distant target that seemed impossibly small. The other soldiers were still talking, some placing bets on whether she'd even hit the target board, let alone the bullseye. But Elena had entered a different world entirely. Her heartbeat slowed to match her breathing. The wind patterns became as readable as text on a page. The shimmer from the heat stopped being a distraction and became simply another variable to account for. Her father's voice echoed in her memory. "Mija, shooting isn't about the gun. It's about becoming still enough to let the shot happen through you." She had spent years learning what that meant. Countless hours in the desert, shooting at targets her father would set up at increasing distances, learning to read wind, to compensate for elevation, to understand how temperature affected bullet trajectory. But more than the technical skills, she had learned something deeper. How to find absolute calm in the middle of chaos. The rifle settled against her shoulder like it belonged there. Through the scope, the target came into focus. At this distance, the bullseye looked like a dot, barely visible even with magnification. The wind was gusting unpredictably, and she could feel the eyes of dozens of skeptical soldiers boring into her back. She took one final breath and let half of it out, the way her father had taught her. In that moment of perfect stillness, she squeezed the trigger. Bang! The first shot cracked across the desert, and through the scope, she watched the target paper jerk as the bullet found its mark. Dead center, perfect bullseye. The voices behind her quieted slightly, but she barely noticed. She was already lining up the second shot, her body moving with the automatic precision of someone who had done this thousands of times before. The rifle recoiled, settled, and she was ready for the next shot almost before the sound of the previous one had faded. Bang! Another bullseye. Now the range had gone completely silent except for the sound of her rifle. Shot after shot, each one finding the exact center of the target. The soldiers who had been joking and betting were now staring in disbelief. This wasn't just good shooting. This was something approaching the supernatural. 5 shots, 10 shots, 12 shots. By the 13th shot, someone whispered, "No way! This isn't possible." Elena didn't hear him. She was locked in perfect communion with her weapon, her breathing, and the target. Each shot was inevitable, as natural as her heartbeat. The external world had ceased to exist. There was only the rhythm of breathing, aiming, firing, and the satisfaction of watching each bullet find its home in the exact center of the target. 14th shot, 15th shot. When she finally lowered the rifle, the silence was absolute. 15 shots. 15 perfect bullseyes. Not one had strayed even slightly from dead center. In conditions that had made experienced soldiers hesitate to even attempt a single shot, this small woman had just delivered a performance that defied belief. The range instructor was staring through his spotting scope, counting the holes in the target again and again as if the numbers might change. The SEAL candidates who had been so vocal about her inadequacies were now speechless, their faces pale with something between shock and embarrassment. One of them finally found his voice. That's impossible. Nobody shoots like that." Elena stood up slowly, dust falling from her uniform. She didn't smile, didn't celebrate, didn't even acknowledge the stunned faces around her. She simply began the methodical process of cleaning her rifle, ejecting the empty magazine, and organizing her remaining ammunition with the same calm precision she had shown throughout the entire performance. The desert wind picked up again, reminding everyone of the challenging conditions she had just mastered. But Elena seemed untouched by it all, existing in her own space of perfect calm. What would you do if everyone stronger than you had already taken cover? If you were there, would you have the courage to stand up? Or would you hide behind the rocks like everyone else? As Elena continued cleaning her weapon with methodical precision, one of the older SEAL officers stepped closer, his eyes fixed on something that had caught his attention. The faded silver patch on her uniform, barely visible against the desert camouflage, suddenly seemed to glow with significance under his scrutiny. "Wait a minute," he whispered, his voice carrying a tone of recognition that made others lean in. That patch, isn't that from Cruz Sr.? The question hung in the desert air like smoke from a fired round. Elena's hands paused for just a moment in their methodical cleaning routine, but she didn't look up, didn't acknowledge the question. The patch had been with her for so long that she sometimes forgot others might recognize its meaning. Another officer moved closer, studying the insignia with growing understanding. Cruz? Martinez Cruz from Desert Storm? The one who saved that SEAL team in Iraq? Now Elena did look up, her dark eyes meeting the gaze of men who suddenly saw her in an entirely different light. The mockery and dismissal that had followed her for weeks evaporated in an instant, replaced by something approaching reverence. The story began to emerge in whispered fragments. Martinez Cruz had been a Special Forces operator during the Gulf War, part of a classified mission that had gone catastrophically wrong. A SEAL reconnaissance team had been trapped behind enemy lines, surrounded and outgunned, with no hope of extraction. The official rescue mission had been scrubbed due to political complications and impossible odds. Martinez Cruz had gone in anyway, operating alone. Using skills honed in the brutal training grounds of the Southwest Desert, he had infiltrated enemy territory and single-handedly extracted the entire SEAL team. The mission had never been officially recognized, the details buried in classified files that would never see daylight. But the men he had saved never forgot. The patch Elena wore was one of only 7 ever made, given to the members of Martinez Cruz's unit who had participated in unauthorized rescue missions throughout the conflict. It represented a brotherhood that existed outside official channels, bound by loyalty rather than regulations. "She's his daughter," someone said, and the words carried the weight of revelation. Elena had grown up listening to the desert wind and the sound of gunfire. Her father had trained her not as a hobby or sport, but as a legacy. Every skill she possessed had been passed down from a man who understood that sometimes the most important missions were the ones that never appeared in official records. The shooting performance they had just witnessed wasn't the result of natural talent or lucky conditions. It was the culmination of years of training that began when she was barely tall enough to hold a rifle, guided by a man who had learned his skills in the crucible of combat. Martinez Cruz had taught his daughter to shoot like her life depended on it, because he understood that someday it might. The range fell into a different kind of silence now. The men who had dismissed her as a diversity experiment or political statement were confronting the reality that they were in the presence of military royalty. Elena Cruz wasn't just some woman trying to break barriers. She was the daughter of a legend, carrying forward a tradition of service that predated most of their military careers. But perhaps more unsettling was the realization of what they had almost missed. How many times had they overlooked her quiet competence? How many opportunities had they wasted to learn from someone who had been raised in the traditions of elite warfare? Their prejudices had blinded them to the possibility that excellence might come in unexpected packages. Elena finished cleaning her rifle and stood up, slinging the weapon across her shoulder with practiced ease. The circle of men around her had grown, but their expressions had transformed completely. Where there had been mockery, there was now respect. Where there had been dismissal, there was now curiosity about what other skills she might possess. She looked around at the faces watching her, seeing the change but not celebrating it. Recognition based on her father's reputation was still recognition for the wrong reasons. She had wanted to earn her place through her own merit, not inherit it through bloodlines. "I don't need a patch to prove where I belong," she said quietly, her voice carrying clearly across the range despite its softness. The statement hit with the force of her bullets. She wasn't trading on her father's legacy or asking for special consideration because of her heritage. She was simply stating a fact. Her actions spoke louder than any symbol or family connection. As she walked away from the range, something had fundamentally shifted in the dynamic of the training base. Elena Cruz was no longer the woman who didn't belong. She was the daughter of Martinez Cruz, inheritor of a tradition that commanded respect even from the most elite units. But more importantly, she was the person who had just demonstrated that courage and skill couldn't be measured by conventional standards. In a world where size and strength were often considered the primary qualifications for elite service, she had proven that precision, dedication, and an unshakable calm under pressure might be even more valuable. The SEAL candidates who had questioned her presence now found themselves questioning their own assumptions about what made someone qualified for the most demanding military service. Elena hadn't just hit 15 bullseyes, she had shattered 15 preconceptions about who could be a warrior. As the desert wind began to die down, the men on the range were left to contemplate an uncomfortable truth. They had just witnessed something extraordinary, and they had almost been too blind to see it. The silence that followed Elena's departure was unlike anything the training base had experienced. It wasn't the comfortable quiet of men taking a break between exercises, or the focused concentration of soldiers studying their next challenge. This was the stunned silence of people whose entire worldview had just been shattered by 15 perfectly placed bullets. No one cheered. No one applauded. The moment felt too significant for casual celebration, too profound for simple acknowledgement. Instead, the SEAL candidates found themselves looking at each other with expressions that mixed embarrassment, respect, and a dawning understanding that they had just witnessed something that would be talked about for years to come. Lieutenant Morrison, one of the more vocal critics of Elena's presence on the base, was the first to break the silence. His voice came out as barely more than a whisper, but in the stillness of the range, everyone heard him clearly. Respect. The single word hung in the air like a prayer. One by one, the other men began to nod, their heads moving in slow acknowledgement of what they had just seen. There were no elaborate speeches, no dramatic declarations, just a simple recognition that they had been wrong, and that Elena Cruz had earned something that couldn't be given or taken away by regulations or policies. Sergeant Williams, who had been skeptical of allowing women in SEAL training, found himself staring at the distant target where 15 holes formed a pattern smaller than his fist. He had been shooting competitively for over a decade, had trained some of the best marksmen in the military, and he had never seen anything approaching what Elena had just accomplished. "I've been doing this for 15 years, he said to no one in particular. "I've never seen shooting like that. Not from anyone." The admission carried weight because Williams was known for his reluctance to praise anyone. His standards were impossibly high, his criticism brutal but fair. For him to acknowledge Elena's performance was equivalent to an official commendation. Others began to share similar thoughts, their voices quiet and respectful. They talked about the wind conditions, the distance, the pressure of performing in front of a hostile audience. Each factor that had made Elena's performance more difficult only added to their growing appreciation of what she had accomplished. But more than the technical aspects of her shooting, they were grappling with the deeper implications of what they had witnessed. Elena hadn't just demonstrated superior marksmanship, she had shown a kind of mental toughness that many of them aspired to, but few achieved. Under intense scrutiny, facing mockery and doubt, she had performed with absolute perfection. As the group began to disperse, heading back to barracks and training schedules, the conversation continued in smaller clusters. The story was already beginning to take on the qualities of legend. Details were being polished, significance was being added, and Elena's 15 shots were becoming the stuff of military folklore. "Did you see how calm she was? Never seen anything like it. Her breathing didn't even change. 15 shots, 15 bullseyes, in that wind." The base dining hall that evening was unusually subdued. Elena sat at her usual table, eating alone as she had every night since arriving. But now, instead of being ignored or deliberately excluded, she was being watched with something approaching awe. Conversations would stop when she passed, not out of hostility, but out of respect. Several soldiers approached her table during the meal, not to apologize directly, but to ask technical questions about shooting techniques, wind reading, and equipment preferences. Elena answered politely but briefly, sharing knowledge without making anyone feel foolish for not already knowing it. By the end of the evening, the social dynamics of the base had completely transformed. Elena was no longer the outsider trying to prove she belonged. She was the expert that others hoped to learn from, the standard against which they would measure their own performance. The transformation was subtle but complete. Respect once withheld had been earned through action rather than demanded through argument, and everyone present understood that they had witnessed something rare. The moment when prejudice collided with undeniable excellence, and excellence won. Elena Cruz never became an official Navy SEAL. The bureaucratic barriers that had blocked her initial application remained firmly in place, impervious to demonstrations of skill or displays of courage. The system that had rejected her application based on gender policies was not designed to reverse itself based on individual merit, no matter how extraordinary that merit might be. But something more powerful than official recognition began to take root in the culture of the training base. Elena's 15 perfect shots had become more than just an impressive display of marksmanship. They had evolved into a symbol of what was possible when someone refused to accept limitations imposed by others. During the most grueling training exercises, when new recruits felt like quitting, when the physical demands seemed impossible and the mental pressure unbearable, instructors would tell the story of the woman who fired 15 straight into the bullseye. They would describe the wind conditions, the hostile audience, the impossible distance, and the perfect calm with which she had overcome every obstacle. If she could do that, they would say, what's stopping you? The story grew with each telling, taking on mythical qualities while somehow never losing its essential truth. New arrivals to the base would hear whispered versions in the barracks, each teller adding their own details but never changing the core facts. 15 shots, 15 bullseyes, perfect conditions or impossible ones. It didn't matter. Some versions focused on the technical aspects of her shooting, turning Elena into a master craftsman whose skills bordered on the supernatural. Others emphasized the psychological pressure she had faced, making her a symbol of grace under fire. Still others highlighted the transformation of the men who had watched her, using the story as a lesson about the danger of underestimating others. But all versions carried the same underlying message. Excellence could come from anywhere, in any form, and it demanded respect regardless of its package. Months after Elena had left the base, her legend continued to grow. Training instructors who had never met her would use her story to motivate struggling candidates. There was a woman here once, they would begin, and everyone knew what story was coming next. The details might vary slightly, but the impact never diminished. New recruits, facing their first major challenges, would ask about her. Is she still here? They would wonder, looking around as if expecting to see a small woman with calm eyes and the steady hands. The answer was always the same. She never left. Because in the most important way, Elena hadn't left. Her presence lingered in every training exercise that pushed someone beyond their perceived limitations. Her influence could be felt in every moment when someone chose courage over comfort, action over excuses, performance over politics. The 15 bullseyes had become more than holes in a target. They had become proof that the most important battles were often fought not against external enemies, but against internal limitations and external prejudices. Elena had faced both and emerged victorious, not through anger or aggression, but through the quiet demonstration of undeniable competence. Years later, SEAL instructors would still reference the crew standard when discussing marksmanship training. It represented not just accuracy, but the ability to perform under pressure, to remain calm in chaos, to let results speak louder than words. The standard was impossibly high, but its existence pushed everyone to reach further than they thought possible. Elena's story had become part of the institutional memory of the base, passed down from class to class like a sacred tradition. It served multiple purposes: inspiration for those who felt excluded, motivation for those who faced challenges, and a reminder for everyone that excellence comes in many forms and should never be dismissed based on appearance or assumptions. The woman who had been rejected for SEAL training had achieved something more lasting than official recognition. She had become a symbol of what the human spirit could accomplish when it refused to accept artificial limitations. Her 15 shots had echoed far beyond that desert training range, inspiring countless others to pick up their own weapons and aim for their own bullseyes. In the end, Elena Cruz had proven the most important truth about courage. It isn't about outrunning bullets or overpowering enemies. Courage is about standing up when no one else dares, about performing when everyone expects you to fail, about maintaining your standards when the world tries to lower them for you. Comment respect. If you believe one act of courage can change everything, subscribe to HL Stories for more untold stories of silent heroes who change the world 15 shots at a time.